The refugee fleet arrived at the edge of Sol system without warning, on a gray morning in the 40th year of humanity's membership in the Interstellar Compact. 180 vessels, most of them barely spaceworthy, carrying the last 3 million citizens of a civilization that had, until 6 months earlier, called itself the High Council of Ithal. The Ithal had ruled a prosperous stretch of the galactic core for 11,000 years before a stellar cascade event. Cruel and entirely indifferent to their empire's long history, tore through their home cluster and left them with nothing but the ships they could fill and the coordinates of whoever might be willing to take them in. Every major power they'd approached in the preceding months had offered polite condolences and no meaningful assistance. Refugee populations were expensive, politically inconvenient, and the Ithal, for all their ancient prestige, no longer had anything to trade that made the inconvenience worthwhile. Humanity said yes within 11 days of the first formal request. Secretary General Sarah Chen, addressing the United Earth Council on the matter, did not frame the decision as a difficult one. "We are being asked whether we have room for 3 million people who have lost everything," she said. "We do. That is, as far as I'm concerned, the entire deliberation this body needs to have." The vote passed with a margin that surprised even the diplomats who'd drafted the resolution. Humanity, not yet a century into its interstellar life, had never fully lost the collective memory of what it felt like to need something nobody else was willing to give. Sanctuary worlds were designated within the month. Terraforming teams that had spent decades perfecting Sol System's own colonial worlds were redirected, without complaint, to accelerate 3 half-formed human outposts into livable Ithal settlements instead. Humanity's own citizens, many of whom had been waiting years for colonial housing allocations of their own, largely absorbed the delay with the same unhurried grace the Council had extended to the crisis itself. There was, inevitably, some dissent. A vocal minority within the United Earth Council argued, in terms that would be quoted with considerable bitterness in the years after the betrayal, that humanity's generosity toward a species it barely knew risked outpacing its obligations to its own citizens. Councillor Priya Bhatt, one of the resolution's most persistent critics, warned during the original debate that hospitality extended without any mechanism for verifying long-term intent was, in her words, an act of faith dressed up as policy, and pressed unsuccessfully for a formal review clause that would revisit the resettlement terms after a fixed probationary period. The review clause was voted down by a wide margin. Potts' warnings were filed away, politely acknowledged, and largely forgotten by the wider public within a year, though several of her original memos would resurface, 11 years later, in the emergency hearings convened in the immediate aftermath of the Great Betrayal, cited by more than one delegate as evidence that the risk had never been entirely invisible, only inconvenient to act on at the time. Ambassador James Whitfield, the diplomat assigned to lead the resettlement effort, met the first wave of Ithal delegates at Earth's primary orbital gateway personally, rather than delegating the welcome to junior staff as protocol technically permitted. He was 52, a career diplomat with a reputation for treating every counterpart, however powerful or however desperate, with the same unhurried, genuine attention. "You have lost your home," he told the assembled Ithal delegation, in the opening remarks that would later be quoted with considerable irony in 100 different contexts across 100 different Ithal military briefings. "We cannot give that back to you. What we can give you is a place to stand while you decide what comes next. That offer has no conditions attached to it beyond the ones any decent neighbor would expect of another." The welcoming ceremonies that followed over the subsequent weeks were lavish by any galactic standard, not out of any strategic calculation, but because humanity had never learned to do hospitality by half measures. Terraforming technology that had taken generations of human research to perfect was shared with Ithal engineers freely, without licensing fees, without the kind of incremental, carefully rationed technology transfer most established powers practiced with client populations. Medical databases, agricultural templates, even portions of humanity's own orbital shipyard infrastructure were made available to help the Ithal rebuild something resembling the industrial base they'd lost. Dr. Elena Vasquez, one of the lead terraforming scientists assigned to the resettlement program, spent the better part of 2 years working directly alongside Ithal engineers, teaching them not just the mechanics of humanity's atmospheric processing systems, but the underlying theory behind them. Knowledge many of her own colleagues privately questioned the wisdom of sharing so completely with a population whose long-term intentions nobody could fully verify. They asked me once why we were being so generous, she recalled, in testimony given years later before a very different kind of hearing. I told them the truth because it was the only answer I had. We'd been the ones needing help, not that long ago in historical terms. Struggling colonies, thin margins, more than one winter where a shipment arriving a week late would have meant real hardship for real people. We remembered what that felt like. Helping them felt less like generosity, and more like paying something forward that had never actually been owed to us in the first place, and that we'd gotten anyway, from people who didn't have to give it. The Ithal engineers she worked with in those early years did not seem to her like people playing a long, patient role. She remembered with particular clarity the birth of a colleague's daughter during the second year of the program, an engineer named Torvek Desu, who had wept unguardedly and without any apparent calculation when Vasquez brought a gift for the newborn that had been handmade rather than replicated, a small gesture that meant considerably more within Ithal cultural custom than she had fully understood at the time. She would return to that memory often in the years after the betrayal, turning it over without ever quite managing to resolve it into something she could file away cleanly as either genuine or false. The Ithal, for their part, were scrupulously, almost theatrically gracious in every public interaction. Diplomatic banquets, joint research announcements, ceremonial addresses thanking humanity for a kindness their own ambassadors repeatedly described in careful and flattering language as unprecedented in the Compact's recorded history. Privately, within the High Council's own restored government in exile, a very different account of that same kindness was already being compiled. Overseer Catherine Vielle, the most senior Ithal official to survive the Cascade event and the de facto leader of the resettlement government, kept a private journal throughout those first years, a document that would not become public until long after the Great Betrayal had already reshaped the galaxy's understanding of what had actually been happening beneath the surface of humanity's hospitality. The humans extend resources without calculating return, one early entry read. Our own analysts initially assumed this reflected a sophisticated long-term strategy, cultivating loyalty through generosity, expecting eventual repayment with interest. 6 months of close observation suggests otherwise. There is no hidden ledger. They simply act as though helping is its own justification. This is either the most naive governing philosophy any species has ever operated under, or evidence of a vulnerability so fundamental it borders on a genetic flaw. Our continuing analysis will determine which. If the setup's got you hooked already, drop a like. It genuinely helps a small channel like this one find new listeners. All right, let's keep going. Vale's private analysis over the following 3 years hardened from tentative hypothesis into settled institutional doctrine. The High Council's restored intelligence apparatus, rebuilding itself quietly within the very infrastructure humanity had provided for resettlement, began compiling what would eventually become a formal internal assessment, classified even within the Ithal government in exile at a level higher than almost anything else in its files, titled, with the same clinical detachment the Ithal brought to most of their governance, an analysis of human empathic governance as strategic vulnerability. The document's central thesis, laid out across nearly 400 pages of behavioral observation, economic data, and diplomatic transcript analysis, argued that humanity's capacity for unconditional generosity represented not a cultural strength, but a fundamental structural weakness. A species-wide inability to prioritize its own long-term interests over the immediate emotional satisfaction of helping others, one that a sufficiently patient adversary could, in principle, exploit indefinitely. They will give until it costs them something they cannot easily replace. One internal briefing to the Council's military command concluded, "Our task is to identify what that threshold actually is, and to position ourselves, over whatever time frame proves necessary, to be standing inside their infrastructure when they finally reach it." The analysts who compiled that briefing were not, by their own later accounts, indifferent to the discomfort of what they were proposing. Several of the document's contributing authors would later testify during the tribunal proceedings, that internal dissent had existed from the earliest drafts. Quiet, carefully worded objections raised in margin notes and closed-door meetings, questioning whether a strategy premised on weaponizing another species' genuine kindness was one the reconstituted council should actually pursue, whatever its tactical merit. Those objections were noted, formally acknowledged in the document's revision history, and ultimately overruled by Overseer Vial himself, who argued in a rebuttal memo that survival, for a civilization that had already lost everything once to circumstances outside its control, did not leave room for the luxury of moral hesitation about a plan capable of guaranteeing it never happened again. What the analysis conspicuously failed to account for, a gap that several of Vial's own subordinates would later admit, in the wreckage of everything that followed, they had noticed and chosen not to raise, was the distinction between generosity and naivety. Humanity's hospitality toward the Ithal had never actually been unconditional in the way the Council's analysts assumed. Every terraforming technology transfer, every shared database, every piece of orbital infrastructure extended to the resettlement program had passed through the same rigorous security review any sensitive technology exchange required under standard compact protocol. Humanity had simply conducted that review quietly, without making a public production of the caution, because Ambassador Whitfield had insisted from the earliest planning sessions that a hospitality extended with visible suspicion attached to it wasn't really hospitality at all. It was a transaction wearing a friendlier face. "We can be careful and we can be kind at the same time," Whitfield told his own oversight committee. In a closed session, the Council's intelligence apparatus never successfully penetrated. Those aren't opposites. I'd ask this committee to trust that we're capable of holding both at once, the same way we'd ask them to trust us with their survival. The committee had trusted him. The security protocols, layered carefully beneath every act of visible generosity, remained in place for the entire duration of the resettlement, quiet, unremarked upon, and, as it would eventually prove, considerably more consequential than either humanity's guests or humanity's own citizens fully understood at the time. For 11 years, the peace held, and by any external measure, it flourished. Ithal settlements grew from provisional refugee camps into genuine, thriving colonies. Joint research initiatives between human and Ithal scientists produced breakthroughs in materials science and long-range propulsion that neither species, working alone, would likely have reached for another generation. A new cohort of Ithal children, born and raised entirely within human-administered space, grew up bilingual in ways their parents' generation had never managed, moving between human and Ithal cultural spaces with an ease that diplomatic optimists on both sides pointed to as proof that the old wounds of the Cascade event were finally, genuinely healing. By the 8th year, the two civilizations had grown intertwined enough that several joint proposals began circulating within the compact's broader diplomatic circles to formalize the relationship beyond its original refugee and host framework entirely. Full civic integration, shared representation in compact affairs, even preliminary discussions about a joint defense treaty that would have merged elements of human and Ithal military command structures for the first time. None of those proposals had yet reached a formal vote by the time of the betrayal, but their existence, once revealed during the tribunal proceedings that followed, would become one of the most painful details of the entire affair for many of the human officials who had championed them in good faith, evidence not merely of a betrayal endured, but of a deeper partnership actively being built, in real time, by people on both sides who had no knowledge that the ground beneath the partnership was being quietly prepared for something else entirely. Overseer Vale's private analysis continued in parallel, unaffected by any of it. 11 years of patient, methodical intelligence work had mapped, in extraordinary detail, the architecture of humanity's core defense and communications networks. Much of it learned not through espionage in any conventional sense, but simply through the ordinary trusted access Ithal engineers had been granted as full partners in humanity's own infrastructure development. Nobody had needed to steal anything. Humanity had, in the spirit of the partnership it genuinely believed it was building, shown them where everything was. The plan that emerged from that decade of patient study was, by the Ithal Military Command's own internal assessment, elegant in its simplicity. A coordinated strike timed to the annual Founding Accord commemoration. The single day each year when human defense fleet stood down to the smallest ceremonial presence in a gesture of goodwill toward the anniversary of the Ithal's original arrival, would use the Ithal's own trusted, deeply embedded access to humanity's shipyards and communications relays to disable Earth's primary defense grid from the inside, simultaneously, across every major human colony, before a single human fleet could mobilize a response. "We do not need to defeat them in open battle," Vial told his assembled military command in the final planning session before the strike. "We need only be standing inside the door they left open for us, on the one day of the year they trust us enough to leave it unguarded. 11 years of patience has earned us exactly that door. We will not waste the opportunity a second time." Quick pause before we go further. If you're new here, this is the part where I ask you to hit subscribe. New stories like this every week, and it genuinely helps more than you'd think. All right, back to it. The Founding Accord commemoration fell that 11th year on a bright, unremarkable morning across most of human space. Public squares filled with joint human-Ithal celebrations, ceremonial fleets standing down to minimal readiness in the same gesture of trust that had marked the occasion every year since the resettlement began. Ambassador Whitfield himself was scheduled to deliver the commemorative address on Earth's Central Plaza, alongside Overseer Vial, in what was meant to be the public high point of 11 years of careful, patient partnership. The strike began 40 minutes before that address was scheduled to begin. Ithal engineers embedded within Earth's primary orbital shipyard, trusted staff, some of them a full decade into their postings, several with families who had grown up entirely within human society, activated dormant access protocols they had spent years quietly cultivating, disabling weapons calibration systems across 3 of humanity's largest defense platforms simultaneously. Similar teams, embedded with the same patient trust across 4 other major human colonies, moved to disable communications relays at the exact same coordinated moment, severing the network humanity would have needed to raise a unified alarm. The precision of the coordination was, by any measure, a formidable achievement. 7 separate embedded teams, spread across 5 different human colonies light years apart, executing an identical sequence within a window of under 90 seconds. After years of patient positioning that had required each of them to maintain, without a single detectable lapse, the appearance of complete, ordinary loyalty to the communities they had spent that same decade building genuine relationships within. Several of the tribunal's later analysts would note, with a kind of grim professional respect they were reluctant to voice publicly, that the operational discipline required to sustain that level of dual loyalty for a full decade, without a single team member breaking under the psychological weight of it, represented one of the most demanding intelligence operations in recorded compact history. A fact that made the plan's ultimate failure when it came, all the more consequential for understanding exactly what had gone wrong at the center of it. For those first critical minutes, it worked exactly as Vial's 11 years of planning had promised it would. Weapons platforms went dark. Communications between colonies scrambled into static. A waiting Ithal strike fleet, quietly assembled over the preceding 2 years under cover of what had been reported to human oversight as expanded colonial supply convoys, began translating into position around 3 of humanity's most populous worlds, preparing to deliver, in a single coordinated strike, the same kind of overwhelming, unanswerable blow the Cascade event had once delivered to the Ithal's own civilization. Dr. Elena Vasquez, still working alongside Ithal colleagues in the orbital shipyard she had helped build over a decade of shared labor, was among the first humans to understand what was actually happening, not through any warning system, but through the simple, visceral wrongness of watching people she had trained, mentored, and considered friends move through the facility with a coordinated purpose that had nothing to do with the ceremony everyone else believed they were preparing for. "I asked one of them directly what was happening," she testified later. "He looked at me for a long moment, someone I'd worked beside for 6 years, someone whose child I'd held the day she was born, and he said, 'You were never meant to understand until it was already finished. I am sorry it will not stay that way for you.' Then he continued exactly what he was doing, and I understood, in that single sentence, that everything about the last 11 years had been true and false at exactly the same time. He had genuinely cared about me. And he had also genuinely known this day was coming since before we ever met. She did not move to stop him in that moment, a decision she would examine in the years that followed, from every angle she could think to examine it from. Some part of her, she admitted later, had simply not been able to reconcile the man standing in front of her with the act he was actively committing, and the gap between those two realities had cost her several critical seconds. She would spend a long time deciding whether she regretted losing. What she did instead, once the shock passed, was exactly what a decade of careful engineering training had taught her to do under pressure. She moved, immediately and without further hesitation, toward the facility's independent emergency relay, the one system in the shipyard that had never been integrated into any shared Ithal human infrastructure, precisely because Ambassador Whitfield's original security architecture had insisted, from the earliest planning sessions, that at least one channel of communication remain entirely outside any hands but humanity's own. It was that relay, more than any single act of heroism, that carried the first confirmed warning of the sabotage to Fleet Admiral Torres's command staff, minutes before the automated failsafe systems came online on their own. What Overseer Vial's 11 years of patient analysis had never fully accounted for. The gap his own subordinates had quietly noticed and never raised, because raising it would have meant questioning a plan the Council had already committed itself to completely, was the layered, careful security architecture humanity had built quietly beneath every act of visible generosity from the very first day of the resettlement. Ambassador Whitfield's original insistence 11 years earlier, that humanity could be careful and kind at the same time, had not been an empty diplomatic sentiment. Every system the Ithal had been granted trusted access to had been built, from its very first line of design specification, with a second hidden layer of monitoring and failsafe architecture that no amount of patient, embedded observation had ever detected, because the humans who designed it had understood, from the outset, exactly what kind of trust they were extending, and had built their generosity to survive the worst-case version of that trust being betrayed. The disabled weapons platforms in the critical minutes after the strike began were not actually dark in the way the Ithal sabotage teams believed. A secondary, fully independent targeting architecture, compartmentalized so completely from the primary systems that even the platform's own regular human crews had never been briefed on its existence, activated automatically the moment the primary system's calibration was tampered with, restoring functional targeting capability within minutes, rather than the hours or days the Ithal plan had assumed would be needed. Fleet Admiral Diego Torres, commanding the ceremonial reserve fleet that had stood down for the founding Accord observance, received the automated failsafe alert less than 3 minutes after the sabotage began, and found himself, in the confused first moments of the crisis, giving an order he had trained his entire career never to expect he would actually need to give. Torres had spent 30 years in service without ever commanding a vessel in genuine combat, a fact he had come, over the course of that career, to regard less as a gap in his experience and more as a quiet marker of the peace humanity had managed to sustain since its earliest interstellar conflicts. He had accepted the ceremonial reserve command 3 years earlier as what most in the fleet considered a comfortable, well-earned posting ahead of retirement, parades, honor escorts, the occasional joint exercise with allied fleets, nothing that had ever seriously threatened to test the training he'd accumulated across 3 decades of otherwise uneventful service. He would say, in testimony given long after the battle, that the strangest part of the entire crisis was not the fighting itself, but the speed with which 30 years of dormant readiness reasserted itself the moment the alert came through, as though some part of him had never actually stopped preparing for exactly this morning, even during the years when preparing for it had felt, to everyone around him, like an increasingly unnecessary formality. "All ceremonial vessels full combat readiness immediately," he said, his voice carrying across a fleet-wide channel that, unlike the Ithal-compromised civilian relays, had never depended on any infrastructure the resettlement program had touched. "This is not a drill. Weapons platforms Delta, Epsilon, and Gamma have been sabotaged. Secondary targeting architecture is online. Engage the Ithal strike fleet the moment it enters engagement range. Do not wait for further confirmation. We do not have time for further confirmation." The Ithal strike fleet, translating into position expecting to find 3 defenseless human worlds. Instead found weapons platforms already reactivating around them. A ceremonial reserve fleet moving to full combat readiness, with a speed no sabotage-crippled defense grid should have been capable of, and a coordinated human response assembling itself within minutes, rather than the hours of chaos Vial's 11 years of planning had promised his command staff. The battle that followed lasted 6 hours, considerably longer and considerably bloodier than either side had expected, precisely because neither side's plan had accounted for the other's true capability. The Ithal strike fleet, though caught without the total surprise it had been promised, was still formidable, and pressed its advantage with the same patient, methodical discipline that had characterized 11 years of quiet preparation. Human losses in those first hours were severe. 3 of the reserve fleet's oldest ceremonial vessels destroyed outright. Hundreds of crew lost before the secondary targeting architecture had fully stabilized across every affected platform. Lieutenant Commander Aisha Bello, piloting one of the reserve fleet's oldest ceremonial cruisers when the sabotage began, later described the first hour of the engagement as the most disorienting experience of her career, precisely because so little of it resembled anything her training had modeled for. "We'd spent that morning in dress uniforms, preparing for a commemorative flyover," she said. 40 minutes later, I was giving my crew combat orders in the same uniforms, because there hadn't been time to change into anything else. I remember thinking somewhere in that first hour that the strangeness of it, fighting for our lives in ceremonial dress, was almost more disturbing than the fighting itself. It felt like proof of exactly how completely they'd planned to catch us with our guard all the way down. Fleet Admiral Torres, watching the tactical display fill with casualties he had never trained to expect on a day that had begun as a celebration, found himself making the same grim calculation every commander in humanity's brief interstellar history had eventually been forced to make. That survival in this moment required a response proportionate not to what the Ithal had managed to accomplish, but to what they had clearly intended to accomplish, had the sabotage succeeded as planned. "They came here to end us in a single morning," he told his command staff, in the brief lull between the battle's opening exchange and the counter-offensive that would define its outcome. "Not to defeat our fleet, not to negotiate better terms. To end us, the way the Cascade event ended their own civilization, using the exact trust we extended them to make certain we never saw it coming. We are not fighting for territory today. We are fighting because the alternative to fighting was already decided for us 11 years ago, by people who smiled at us the entire time they were deciding it. The counteroffensive, once humanity's full defense grid came fully online, moved with a speed and coordination that stunned the Ithal command structure as thoroughly as the initial sabotage had briefly stunned humanity's own. Every advantage the Ithal strike fleet had built its plan around, the element of surprise, the compromised targeting systems, the assumption of hours of human confusion before any organized response could be mounted, evaporated within the battle's first 90 minutes, leaving a numerically superior but strategically unmoored Ithal force, facing a human fleet that had, in the space of a single morning, gone from ceremonial reserve duty to full wartime footing. By the 6th hour, the Ithal strike fleet had lost 2/3 of its committed vessels, its remaining ships scattering toward translation points in a retreat that bore little resemblance to the disciplined, patient force that had translated into human space that morning. Overseer Vial, monitoring the battle's collapse from a command vessel that had never been intended to see direct combat, gave the order to withdraw entirely with less than 1/3 of his original strike force still combat capable. If today's story is hitting for you, drop a like and let me know in the comments. All right, let's see what came next. The immediate aftermath of the Great Betrayal, as it quickly came to be known across human space, was chaotic in ways no single battle report could fully capture. Thousands of Ithal civilians, living peacefully within human colonies with no knowledge of Overseer Vale's true plans, found themselves overnight the objects of a suspicion and fear no amount of individual innocence could fully dispel. Ambassador Whitfield, who had personally welcomed the first wave of Ithal refugees 11 years earlier, and had spent much of the intervening decade defending the resettlement program against critics who called it naive, spent the days immediately following the battle in an unenviable position, publicly defending the continued presence of Ithal civilians, who had played no part in the betrayal, while privately grappling with the fact that people he had considered genuine partners had spent 11 years quietly preparing to end his civilization. He found himself in those first days returning often to Counselor Bhatt's old warnings from the original resettlement debate, not out of any impulse toward self-recrimination, though there was some of that too, but out of a genuine, uncomfortable need to understand which parts of her caution had been prescient and which parts, even in hindsight, he still believed had been wrong. He requested a private meeting with her, the first either of them had held in nearly a decade, in which he told her plainly that he did not believe her original proposal for a formal probationary review clause would have changed anything about what Vial's faction ultimately attempted. A review clause assumes the danger announces itself somewhere along the way, he told her. This danger never announced itself. It waited 11 years specifically because it understood we would eventually stop looking as closely as we looked at the start. I don't think your clause would have caught that. I think the only thing that actually caught it was the quiet architecture we built and never talked about, which is a different lesson than the one either of us was arguing for at the time. I do not regret extending the welcome, he said in a public address delivered less than a week after the battle, his voice carrying a weariness that had not been there 11 years earlier. I want to be clear about that, because I know there are people listening who believe the welcome itself was the mistake. It was not. The mistake, if there was one, was believing that every hand we extended it to would hold it the way it was offered. Most of them did. The Ithal families who have built genuine lives here, who had no knowledge of what their own government was planning, are not responsible for a betrayal that was kept from them as completely as it was kept from us. What I will not do is pretend that 11 years of genuine kindness protects us from the reality that kindness can be studied and mapped and exploited by people patient enough to wait for the right morning to use it against us. Human military command in the weeks following the battle made the deliberate choice not to pursue the retreating Ithal remnant fleet into open extermination, a decision that surprised several of the compact's other member species, who had, in the days immediately following the battle, quietly begun preparing for the possibility that humanity's response might mirror the total sector-ending retaliation some in the wider galaxy still associated with humanity's earlier, more brutal chapters of interstellar conflict. Fleet Admiral Torres, testifying before the emergency compact session convened to address the crisis, explained the restraint in terms that several delegates found, in the context of what had just happened, genuinely difficult to reconcile with their own expectations of a species that had just survived an attempted extermination. We built our response to end their capacity to threaten us again, he said. We did not build it to end them as a people, and I want this chamber to understand that distinction clearly, because I suspect it is the one this chamber least expects from us today. The plan Overseer Vial built took 11 years, and required patience most militaries in this compact would struggle to sustain for 11 months. We do not believe every Ithal citizen shared that patience, or that plan, or even full knowledge that it existed. We believe a relatively small, deeply committed faction within their own government constructed a betrayal that most of their own people never consented to and never knew about. We intend to hold that faction fully accountable. We do not intend to punish 3 million people for a decision a few hundred of their leaders made in rooms those 3 million people were never invited into. One Krelith delegate, present at the session as an observer rather than a formal party to the dispute, pressed Torres directly on whether this restraint reflected genuine principle or simple political calculation, a question several other delegations quietly admitted. Afterward, they had also been curious about but reluctant to ask outright. Both, honestly, Torres answered without hesitation. I don't think those two things are as separable as this chamber sometimes wants them to be. It is genuinely our principle that guilt belongs to the people who chose it, not to everyone who shares a government with them. It is also, genuinely, good long-term strategy for a species that intends to keep existing in this galaxy for a very long time, because a policy of collective punishment eventually runs out of people willing to trust us again, and trust, however badly it was abused this time, is still the thing we've built most of our success in this compact on. I don't think it weakens the principle to admit the strategy points the same direction. I think it's rather the point. The formal accountability process that followed, negotiated over the subsequent months between human authorities and the surviving, considerably diminished Ithal government in exile, resulted in Overseer Vile and 11 of his most senior military commanders being surrendered for trial before a joint human compact tribunal. A resolution the wider galaxy watched with the same close attention it had once paid to humanity's most extreme historical responses to betrayal, and found, in this case, considerably harder to categorize. The tribunal proceedings, held over 6 weeks in a chamber specifically constructed for the occasion, drew observers from across the compact. Delegations curious not simply about the verdict, but about what kind of justice a species with humanity's known capability for total, overwhelming retaliation would actually choose to pursue when the alternative was fully available to it. Overseer Vale offered the opportunity to speak in his own defense before the tribunal's final session, used the moment not to plead for leniency, but to offer the same clinical, unflinching analysis that had characterized his entire 11-year campaign. "I do not ask this chamber for forgiveness," he said. "I do not believe forgiveness is owed to me, and I would find it a strange thing to receive even if it were offered. I built my plan on an accurate observation and an inaccurate conclusion. The observation was correct. Your species extends kindness without demanding proof of worthiness first. That much I studied correctly across 11 years. My error was concluding that kindness offered without conditions must therefore be kindness offered without defense. I mistook the absence of visible suspicion for the absence of preparation. I was wrong, and 3,000 of my own people died confirming exactly how wrong I was. In a battle I convinced them we could not lose." The tribunal's presiding officer, a Solvane jurist with centuries of experience adjudicating disputes far smaller in scale than the one now before her, pressed him further. "You speak of your own error with considerable precision," she said. "You do not speak in this statement of the 3,000 human dead your plan also produced. I would ask you to address that omission directly, if you're capable of it." Vale was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I am capable of it," he said. "I have simply found across the months of this confinement that I do not trust myself to speak about it without the words becoming a performance of remorse rather than remorse itself, and I did not want to offer this chamber a performance. 3,000 humans died because I believed wrongly that I understood exactly how far their kindness extended and exactly where its defenses stopped. I did not understand either of those things. I understood their kindness well enough to exploit it. I never understood it well enough to see what it was actually built on top of. That failure of understanding is the whole of what I am responsible for, and it is not a small thing to be responsible for. I do not need to perform grief to know its weight." Ambassador Whitfield, called to testify during the same session, was asked directly by the tribunal's presiding officer whether he believed humanity's continued policy of extending trust to refugee populations should change in light of what the Ithal betrayal had revealed about the risks of that trust. "No," Whitfield said without hesitation, and the simplicity of the answer visibly unsettled several observers who had expected something more complicated. "I understand why this chamber might expect a different answer. I've spent the weeks since the battle asking myself the same question you're asking me now, more times than I can count, and I keep arriving at the same conclusion. The failure 11 years ago was never that we offered too much trust. It was that we let ourselves believe for a while that offering trust and maintaining vigilance were somehow in tension with each other, that being careful would make our kindness feel conditional, and that a conditional kindness wasn't worth extending at all. We were wrong about that specific tension. We were not wrong to help 3 million people who had lost everything. Those are two different lessons, and I would ask this tribunal and this compact not to collapse them into the same one just because it would be simpler to draw." The tribunal's final judgment, delivered after 6 weeks of testimony, sentenced Vile and his senior commanders to indefinite confinement rather than execution, an outcome that satisfied almost no one entirely, criticized by some as too lenient for an attempted extermination, and by others as an unnecessary continuation of hostility toward a defeated, largely powerless remnant government. The presiding tribunal officer, in her closing statement, addressed that dissatisfaction directly. This tribunal was never going to produce a verdict that felt like sufficient closure for what was attempted here, she said. 3,000 people died in a single morning because a government they trusted spent 11 years planning their extinction. No sentence available to this chamber undoes that. What this chamber can offer, and has chosen to offer, is a judgment proportionate to what was actually done, rather than to the fear of what might have been done had the plan succeeded completely. We hold Overseer Vale and his command staff fully accountable for their choices. We do not extend that accountability to 3 million people who never made those choices themselves. Quick note before we finish this one. If you want to see more of this universe, what happened to the surviving Ithal settlements, let me know in the comments. And if this is your first time here, hit subscribe. New stories every week. In the years that followed, the surviving Ithal population within human space split, gradually and without any formal mandate requiring it, into 2 distinct communities. A significant minority, unable to separate their own identity from the shame of what their government had attempted, petitioned for and eventually received passage to a newly designated Ithal homeworld, a modest, habitable system the compact formally allocated to what remained of Ithal civilian governance, distant enough from human space to represent a genuine fresh start, close enough that the 2 civilizations were not entirely severed from each other. The allocation process itself became, in its own quiet way, one of the more meaningful gestures of the entire recovery period. Several compact member species, watching humanity's handling of the crisis with the same close attention they had once brought to its more famous historical extremities, offered to contribute resources toward the new Ithal homeworld's development, a gesture few of the involved parties bothered to frame explicitly, but which several delegates later admitted in private had been motivated, at least in part, by a desire to be associated with the more measured, careful version of humanity's response, rather than to be seen standing apart from it. Elder Isara of the Solvane, whose own long institutional memory had spanned both of humanity's defining crises by that point, offered a formal contribution of Solvane terraforming expertise to the new settlement, accompanied by a brief public statement that several historians would later cite as capturing something essential about how the wider galaxy's understanding of humanity had shifted across the span of both events. I have watched this species answer atrocity with annihilation, and I have watched it answer betrayal with something considerably harder to name, she said. I find I trust the second response more than I ever expected to trust the first, and I would like this small gesture to reflect that. A larger portion, including many of the second generation who had been born and raised entirely within human society, chose to remain. Dr. Elena Vasquez continued her work at the orbital shipyard she had helped build, now training a new generation of engineers, human and Ithal alike, in the same patient, careful craft that had once made the facility vulnerable to exactly the kind of betrayal it had eventually survived. I think about that conversation often, she said years later, referring to her final exchange with the colleague who had helped sabotage the very facility they'd built together. He told me I was never meant to understand until it was already finished. I've come to believe he was talking about more than just the plan. I don't think he understood, until it was already finished, what 11 years of genuine friendship had actually done to him either. I don't excuse what he did. I will never excuse it. But I don't think a person spends 11 years pretending to care about someone's newborn daughter without some of that caring becoming real, whether or not he ever let himself examine it closely enough to notice. Ambassador Whitfield remained in his post for another decade, overseeing what the Compact eventually came to regard as one of the more delicate diplomatic recoveries in its recorded history. Not the restoration of Ithal human relations specifically, which settled into something workable if permanently altered, but the broader question of what humanity's own capacity for trust would look like going forward, now that the galaxy had watched in vivid and costly detail exactly what could happen when that trust met a sufficiently patient betrayal. It was, by his own account, the hardest decade of his career, considerably harder than the 11 years that preceded it, precisely because the work was so much less visible. Building the original resettlement program had been a public, celebrated undertaking, full of ceremonies and joint announcements and the particular satisfaction of watching something good come together in real time. Rebuilding humanity's own institutional confidence after the betrayal offered none of that visible reward. It was closed-door hearings, quiet policy revisions, careful conversations with colonial administrators who had watched trusted colleagues turn out to be sleeper agents, and now struggled to know how much of their remaining trust in anyone was still reliable. Whitfield attended more of those conversations personally than his staff ever fully understood, treating the individual, unglamorous work of rebuilding one administrator's confidence at a time as no less important than the grand diplomatic architecture he'd once been more famous for building. "People keep asking me whether we learned to trust less," he said in one of his final public addresses before retirement. "I don't think that's the right question, and I've had a long time to think about what the right one actually is. We learn to trust the same way we always did, openly, generously, without demanding proof of worthiness before extending it, because I still believe that's the only kind of trust actually worth having. What we learned to do differently was stop pretending that kind of trust and careful preparation were somehow opposed to each other. We can open the door all the way and still know exactly what we'd do if someone walked through it wrong. I think that's the only version of hospitality sturdy enough to survive contact with a galaxy this large. The soft kind, offered without any spine underneath it, was never going to last. This kind might." Overseer Vale, in the final months of his confinement before his death some years later, requested and was granted a single visitor, Dr. Vasquez, who had spent considerable time deciding whether to accept the request at all before finally agreeing to it. She arrived at the confinement facility uncertain what she actually intended to say to him, and left hours later, feeling no more certain than she had walking in, a fact that surprised her less than she expected it to. The facility itself was modest, functional, deliberately unremarkable in a way she suspected had been chosen carefully by whoever designed it, as though the tribunal had wanted Vile's remaining years to carry no more symbolic weight than the plain, ordinary passage of time itself. He asked her in that final conversation whether she believed the 11 years had meant anything at all, or whether everything he had shown her, every late night in the shipyard, every small kindness exchanged between colleagues who genuinely liked each other's company, had simply been performance in service of the plan from the very first day. She considered the question for a long time before answering. "I used to think it had to be one or the other," she said. "I don't think that anymore. I think you meant all of it. And I think you were also always going to do what you did. And I've stopped trying to figure out how both of those things fit together in the same person, because I don't think they're supposed to fit neatly. I think that's just what it looks like when someone spends 11 years being two different people at once and never lets themselves notice which one was actually true." She did not tell him whether she forgave him. He did not ask. The galaxy, in the years that followed the Great Betrayal, added a new and carefully worded entry to its accumulating understanding of humanity, one that sat, somewhat uneasily, alongside older entries about restraint and patience, and the particular danger of assuming a species' kindness told you anything reliable about its capacity for defense. "They will open every door they have," the entry read, in most of its translated forms. "Do not mistake the opening for an absence of what waits carefully, quietly on the other side of it." Sophia Whitfield Dessou, the granddaughter of the murdered Ithal engineer whose newborn daughter Elena Vasquez had once brought a handmade gift for, grew up within that entry's shadow without ever fully choosing to, half Ithal, half human by later marriage within the community that remained, raised on a homeworld she had never seen, and a betrayal she had not lived through but had inherited all the same. She became, in adulthood, one of the leading historians of the Great Betrayal's aftermath, dedicating much of her career to documenting the lives of the Ithal families who had stayed, who had rebuilt something honest, out of a decade whose foundation had turned out to be only partly true. She closed her own definitive account of the period with a line that several later readers found more clarifying, in its plain simplicity, than anything the tribunal's formal record had managed across 6 full weeks of testimony. "My grandfather chose a plan that cost him everything," she wrote. "He did not choose the 11 years that came before it. I have decided, after a great deal of trying not to, that I am allowed to hold both of those facts about him at once, and that doing so is not the same thing as forgiving what the plan cost the people who trusted him. Thanks for sticking with this one all the way through. It means a lot. If this story hit for you, drop a like, subscribe for more stories like it every week, and let me know down in the comments what you'd want explored next in this universe. See you in the next one.